The Gospel reading is from Matthew. Its title is The Suicide of Judas. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Most funerals are a difficult time, but the funeral of a person who has taken their life by suicide is even more difficult. Family and friends are confused. Counselors have identified several stages that we go through while grieving. These stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But none of us proceeds through these stages in a linear or straight line fashion. For the families and the loved ones of someone who has chosen to end their life, it is as if all of the stages of grief have been poured into a blender, and then this mixture is poured into the survivors. Because of their confusion, family and friends wonder whether it's all right just to grieve and feel the sadness and sorrow for the one they have just lost, for the one who has been torn from their lives, often with little warning. Or should they feel guilt and shame because the one who has been wrenched from their lives died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound? In many cases, family and friends do simply feel guilt and shame, but they shouldn't. And that was my point 2 years ago and is still my point today. And it is my point for all those who have attempted suicide yet failed, and for the families of those who have. That is my point for the families and survivors. Suicide is neither selfish nor cowardly. And let me say that again because people have a prejudice about those who attempt suicide. One definition of prejudice is to hold an ill-informed opinion. The belief that suicide is a selfish or cowardly act is a prejudice. It is an ill-informed opinion. Suicide is neither selfish nor cowardly. Now, those who hold these opinions, needless to say, are survivors. But I wonder if, more often than not, the folks who feel this way have a distance from the family. They are neither close friends nor immediate family, because close friends and immediate family are often well aware of the anguish that their loved one lived with. In a few days before Roy Gonzer's funeral, I had little time to research suicide. But since then, I have. And what I have found is that suicide is an attempt to relieve intense psychological pain. Suicide is an attempt to relieve intense psychological pain. I've conducted 2 funerals for suicide victims, Joe Licht and Roy Gonzer. And earlier, before I came here, Reverend Laird Keever conducted the funeral for Dustin Kai. And from what I know, in all three cases, these men, one a young man, indeed experienced intense psychological pain prior to taking their own lives. And make no mistake, psychological pain, intense psychological pain, is equally, if not more painful than physical pain. Now, these older men had experienced this kind of pain for a while prior to taking their own lives. In Dustin's case, however, the pain seemed to be acute and immediate, and the effect of alcohol impaired his ability to see that his pain might have any other end than the one he chose. Intense psychological pain is a long diagnostic term that can feel clinical. And that is the reason that I accent the word intense. Intense psychological pain. But this pain can be named in a single word, and that word is despair. And despair is a complete loss of hope, to be overcome by a sense of futility or defeat. Now, almost all of us have been depressed at one time or another in our lives. And in this human life, we will probably feel depressed again. Most of us, however, do not despair. And we do not enter in despair even if what moves us is not necessarily hope, but sheer and dogged, and in our area, German determination. We get up, we put one foot in front of the other, and we continue to do this until things sort themselves out, as we say. But in a single word, I believe that despair is what overcame particularly Roy Gonzer. And that is what overcomes many, if not most, if not all, victims of suicide. Now, when I talk about despair, I describe it this way. It's as if you're in a pit. You're in a deep, dark pit. You just can't see anything. And you feel around on the wall for a handhold or a toe hold. You know those climbing walls that have handholds and toe holds? Well, in the pit of despair, there are none. There are no handholds and no toe holds. There is no first step. There is no initial action that you can take that begins to put one foot in front of the other until things sort themselves out. What was it David Burmeister said, Elizabeth? You have to be somewhere to go somewhere, and in a deep, dark pit like this, you're not somewhere, and you can't get anywhere. And this is what despair feels like. Do you want to go there? I don't. But that is where every victim, or almost every victim of suicide, ultimately finds themselves, whether they succeed or not. Those who succeed, however, found no handhold, no toehold, and no way out. They found no way out. Karen read to us from Psalm 69 this morning, and because the psalmist describes despair for us in the vivid way that only a poet can, let's hear those words again. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire, where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying, my throat is parched, my eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. On this psalm, one pastor has commented, "In some respects, this language is picture language. It helps us understand how another one feels. But in other respects, it's absolutely theological. Those who on this earth are despairing can stand nowhere and are indeed drowning within their sorrows." Those who on this earth are despairing can stand nowhere and are indeed drowning within their sorrows. This is what those who attempt suicide feel like. And the last thing, the very last thing that is possible for them is to snap out of it or just get over it. Now, my particular concern at the funeral of a suicide victim is the family. And that concern centers on the shame and guilt around suicide. For centuries, for many sorry centuries, the Church, first the Roman Catholic Church, deemed suicide a mortal sin. Now, a mortal sin is one for which you cannot be forgiven. The Church considered suicide to be self-murder, and hence a violation of the command, "Do not kill." And as with many regrettable beliefs in the Christian faith, the belief that suicide is a mortal sin, an unforgivable sin, begins with Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo in Africa. Augustine also brought us such other unbiblical notions as original sin and the rejection of the body, which has led to the sorry and unhealthy attitudes about sex that have pervaded the Christian church for 1,000 years. Everybody listen up now. The Bible never renders taking one's own life a sin. And I quote to you from Dr. Lloyd Carr's book about suicide entitled "Fierce Goodbye." Samson was one of the big suicides who pulled the temple down on himself as well as the Philistines. Ahithophel, one of David's leading cabinet members, sided with Absalom in a rebellion, and he ended up being on the wrong side and went home and hanged himself. One of the kings of Israel, Zimri, ruled in the northern kingdom for 7 days and burned himself to death in the palace when he realized he was on the losing side again. King Saul and his armor-bearer committed suicide on the battlefield, and Abimelech in the book of Judges committed suicide after a battle when he was seriously injured. In most of the Old Testament cases, the suicide is a result of either a military defeat or a serious injury. A serious injury where someone will die in a matter of hours or at the most days, either at the hands of the enemies or just by dying from the wound. And in most of these cases, the individual chose death with honor rather than being tortured and mutilated. So suicide was a way to avoid that kind of shame. In the biblical record, there is no condemnation of suicide. In 2 or 3 cases, there is an indication that there was a burial, which is an indication that the death was not sinful. Samson, Ahithophel, and Saul. If you read the accounts in Matthew and Acts, Judas is never condemned for suicide. He's condemned for betraying Jesus, but not the way he died. And that pattern follows pretty much all the way through. In Hebrews 11, Samson is listed among those who have found God's favor. So you've got this rather ambivalent attitude. They've killed themselves, but they're not condemned for that. And where there is an indication of a burial, those people are given a normal burial. The Bible recognizes suicide as a reality, It treats suicide as just another death, and the ultimate statistic is one birth, one death. We can't avoid that until Christ returns. Suicide is never mentioned as a sin in Scripture. Those who are condemned are not condemned for suicide, but for what they had done before the suicide. On the basis of what the biblical material says, there aren't real grounds for saying suicide is any worse than any other sin and is forgivable just like any other. And those are pastoral words that a family needs to hear at the funeral. While despair may lead to death, in the biblical record it does not lead to damnation. As a result, it should not lead to condemnation within the Christian community. And the survivor should neither be shaved nor be made to feel guilty by the community because of their loved one's act. About 30,000 people die from suicide in the United States each year, and 10 times as many, 350,000 survivors are created. 1.5 times as many people die in the U.S. from suicide than from homicide. It's not a number we would think. 1.5 times as many people die from suicide as from homicide. In the developed world, we know that 90% of the people who attempt suicide have psychological issues, according to Alan Berman from the American Association of Suicidology. We have effective treatments for most of these, but the tragedy is people die from temporary feelings of hopelessness, things we can help them with. Among people with mental health disorders who attempt suicide, 60% have depression or bipolar disorder. Anxiety, psychosis, personality disorder, and other mental health issues are also frequently associated with suicidal behavior. This is not selfishness or cowardliness. To make sure that loved ones get the help they need, people should be aware of the signs that can predict suicidal behavior. There is an acronym, IS PATH WARM. I is for ideation, S is for substance abuse. Ideation is, are they having suicidal thoughts? PATH refers to feelings of purposelessness, anxiety, being trapped, or hopelessness. WARM lists the behaviors of withdrawal, anger, recklessness, and mood change. Now our task as the church is to become Christ. That is, to become the Word made flesh for those who are considering suicide, as well as for the family and survivors. That is, we need to be present to all of their pain. Suicide is preventable with the right treatment, and there is treatment for the pain the victim is feeling. Suicide always brings anguish and pain. While the act of suicide may bring an end to the victim's pain, the survivor's pain just begins. The same psalm that expresses the despair of the suicide victim also offers hope and comfort to the survivors. But as for me, my prayer is to thee, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love. Answer.